Welcome back, everyone. Today, we are joined by Paul Warburg of the Paul Warburg channel and the Icarus Project, a prominent geopolitical YouTuber and someone who we've had on the program before. It's great to see you, Paul. How are you getting on? Is it a tough time for you right now, giving Iran, knowing what to talk about? I don't even know where to start trying to keep up with it all.
I haven't been this busy in a long time, man.
Yeah, it's
You're
crazy.
probably ahead of me because you've been awake for all day and my day is just starting. So there's probably some things that have happened today that you know about that I don't, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, you're in the central part of the US, right? And
That's
I'm
correct,
in
yeah.
London. Yeah, no, I think, well, we're on day 12 for everyone joining. We're mainly going to be focusing on the war with Iran, the United States, and Israel. But I think what's really stood out to me is the messaging, the telegraphing around the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC seems to be trying to exercise this sort of deterrence that it can control the Strait of Hormuz, but the Americans claiming that they've now destroyed 16, I think it is, naval assets. So when you look at what each side is doing over the Strait, does it give you any clear indication of who's telling the truth?
It's a great question. My observation is this is like a media war, right? So oil prices are going up. Trump makes an announcement, the war is going to be over soon. Oil prices go down. Then Iran makes an announcement, no, we're going to continue terrorizing the Strait. Oil prices go up, and it seems like the markets are responding to what people are saying rather than, what's actually happening and what capabilities are actually long term. I tend to believe the United States is probably more likely to be accurate, that in the long term they're going to be able to keep the Strait open. I wouldn't be surprised if Iran could keep it closed for a little bit further, though. A lot to discuss, but what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, just to dive straight into it, I guess then, and I'm curious for people if they've got any questions, then do drop them in the comments, and we'll be sure to try and weave them into the conversation over the next 45 minutes, an hour. But for me, it just comes back to simply, if the Iranians do decide to mine this very narrow stretch of water, right, Paul? It's not a big, vast ocean or a lake or something. It's a tight area. The Americans are saying that they would demine it. How on earth are you going to do that? You're going to have to put assets in there which are directly on the border of Iran. The IRGC is still very strong. There's not really any sign. I think even the New York Times published a piece yesterday stating that the system as a whole, right, the Islamic system is largely just operating quite normally. Of course, it's been battered, but it's not dysfunctional. So that just means that the Americans, if they were trying some demining operation, would be sitting ducks for strikes from the mainland, let alone maritime, U-boats or equivalent of that, these dinghies. So for me, I just don't see what way the Americans could, one, prevent it in the sort of longer scheme of things, but two, even if they were to try to demine it, what that would look like. I just don't think that the Iranians have a poor hand here. They're obviously not able to go toe-to-toe with the Americans, but this kind of operation is not a kinetic, conventional war, is it? It's an asymmetrical warfare. It's very disjointed. So for me, I think that's a huge element. I think the Iranians are applying, the right amount of pressure on specific pressure points. So that's sort of how I look at it on when we first heard this news a couple of days ago, I think.
Yeah, a couple thoughts on that from my perspective. So Iran suffers just as much from a blockage of the Strait of Hormuz as anybody else, as does China, who is Iran's main partner. What we've seen from Iran so far when it comes to mining, to me, so far seems a little bit like a bluff. We've seen them laying mines, but it's been a very small amount that's been confirmed, almost just enough to say we're serious without actually, being serious and putting mines down. In the short term, of course, Iran, if they're just struggling for regime survival or just struggling to hit back at the global economy because they think they're going down anyways, of course they could mine the Strait. But I actually don't think they have a whole lot of incentive personally to actually do that, but it does make them look stronger to keep that open as an option. If they were really to mine the Strait, I don't think it's impossible to demine it. I just think it's not possible to do it without casualties. But this is a war, and that's that's unfortunately, that's kind of a normal reality of warfare, right? There's a lot of historical precedents that we could point to. Probably the most relevant, the tanker war, as it was dubbed in the Persian Gulf, the Iran-Iraq war. Hundreds of, oil tankers and other kinds of shipping vessels were hit and damaged during that, and they kept going because that shipping was important. And even though there were high costs, it was deemed worthwhile to continue it. A less specifically relevant example, but still relevant in terms of human behavior, there's World War II with the U-boats terrorizing the Atlantic shipping. They're obviously taking offline a large number of tankers, but the trade continues because it's important. And so for me, I do see kind of a disconnect where a lot of people are afraid of the Strait of Hormuz being closed because it's so valuable to global shipping, not just oil trade, but so many other things. But they also think that it will remain closed for a long period of time and that people won't risk anything at all. They won't risk life or property to continue traversing the strait. And I just don't think that's true. I think it's high enough value that people will risk those things if it comes to it, to traverse the Strait of Hormuz. And unfortunately, there would be casualties of that, but I don't think that they would really have a choice, because if you don't do it, I'm not even talking about the oil trade primarily. I'm not actually that worried about that. We can talk about that later. But if they don't do it, we're talking about food supply for the Gulf states and things like that. And the casualties of not doing it would be far greater than doing it, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I'm not a intricate expert on Middle Eastern affairs. I look at it from a great power competition, a grand strategic perspective, how the big powers, if you like, are sort of influencing it here. But one thing I have been very interested in recent months is the Iran-Iraq war and the Gulf War, just because of the precedent they set for how warfare can be done in the Middle East, depending upon certain factors, right? The Iran-Iraq war was a land-based conflict because they were neighboring each other. But everyone who's talking about a potential sort of ground operation with American Kurdish-led forces is, I think, getting quite ahead of themselves. And just when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, what I find quite fascinating is that this would be a highly, highly delicate operation to undertake. And therefore, you would need some of the Gulf states involved. We've been talking about this for much of the conflict at this point, whether the Gulf states are going to get involved. And whilst the Emirates and Qataris are defending themselves, they're not actively engaged in offensive operations like the US and Israel are. It's the same with much of Europe. So I think if any operation of this kind were to be done, it would have to be done with a coalition of forces. But then that makes me go to the Gulf War that I mentioned just now, because that was a coalition of, I think, 50 nations, and they had tanks, they had airplanes, they had helicopters, they had naval assets. It was a full-fledged conflict. This is predominantly an aerial battle, or an aerial focused campaign by the coalition. So I just don't see the parameters right now being the same. The US is really going to have to up the amount of commitment it gives, the amount of assets it implements or introduces, and therefore the risks to American personnel. But the last point I wanted to make before I throw it back to you is simply, the other thing about this is it's not only the Strait of Hormuz, it's the Gulf of Aden, right? The Houthis haven't really been very employed in this so far. And I always think there's a slight difference of how the Houthis have their relationship with the Islamic Republic. They've always been slightly more independent than, say, Hamas or something. But if they were to be getting involved, they could put pressure on the Gulf of Aden. And then to your last point you mentioned about sort of general commerce, right? That's the Gulf of Aden is up to the Red Sea. And so you've got a huge amount of economic pressure, not just in the oil markets or energy security, but overall trade flows. So, and then they could maybe bring in Al-Shabaab and the Somali pirates in the Greater Horn of Africa. Like, the whole thing can quickly spill out of control. Then that pulls in Turks, that pulls in Ethiopia. You can keep going and going, but you know what I mean? I don't think we've seen the end of it.
Certainly all those things could come into play. I think the factor here is still, though, that for better or for worse, the United States, the gloves are off now. They're, bombing Iran with abandon. The Houthis have attacked, the Gulf of Aden before, but they haven't really been that successful. Sure, they've stopped some shipping, and the U.S., when the U.S. attacks the Houthis, they pretty much get on their best behavior pretty quickly, and that's in the past in much smaller scale conflicts. So I think, it's not that we're not going to see them do anything. I do have some faith in the capabilities of the U.S. military, specifically the capabilities of the U.S. military in this case, that that they could get the job done. And again, it wouldn't be a situation where there's no casualties or anything like that, but they could get the job done. I think obviously the main factor here, it's a new kind of warfare. I've been talking about this a lot on my channel lately. It's drone warfare. Iran obviously has Shahed drones. They're quite effective at what they do. They're quite cheap. The United States is shooting them down with expensive interceptors. And so that could become a problem in the short to mid-term, because we may not want to use up our entire stockpile. That puts us in a really weak position, especially if China decides to do something against Taiwan. But of course, we already see Ukraine coming into play in a major way. The one article I did read when I woke up this morning before I jumped on here was that Ukraine seems very close to reaching a deal with the Saudis to get them some interceptor drones really quickly. We've seen how effective those are over Ukraine. It's not a 100% success rate, but out of hundreds of Russian drones that'll come in a wave, drones and missiles, only a couple are getting through. Everybody talks about the ones that get through. There's a lot less focus on the ones that don't, obviously, because they're not hitting apartment buildings and causing explosions and things. So, when it comes to the global shipping, I think Ukraine's capabilities are going to help out a lot here in the mid to long term, if the conflict goes that long, to kind of help overcome these weaknesses.
Yeah, I think that the Ukrainian angle is something I wanted to touch on with you a little bit later, because obviously I think that's what a lot of our audiences know us for, or come to view us for. And in my mind, to take a step back a bit, you mentioned China. Now, from my understanding, Beijing has been putting tacit pressure on Tehran not to fully close the strait, even if they could. And that's because China doesn't want to get more involved with this than they can, already are. I've got some insider knowledge that tells me that the Chinese have been supporting the Iranians with economic means, or non-lethal aid, I suppose is the best way to put it. Others, we know about the suggestions of Russian intelligence provision to the IRGC as well. So it does seem like these two are tacitly supporting the Iranians. Now, I made a video yesterday it was an article, it's a Substack article about Russia's broader strategical wins and losses from this. And overall, the longer that the war goes on and the disruptions occur to oil, like it's now, I haven't looked at the direct levels, I think it's gone above 105 right as we speak. That's such a benefit for Moscow right now. It's exactly what they needed, this windfall, this relief from the sanctions, this ability to refund the war economy, right? So when you see the broader economic disruptions to the oil markets and stuff, how do you look at that in the context of Russia and everything else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I've made videos about this. I don't worry about it too much in the long term. There's a very large, well, not just a very large difference. There's a couple very large differences between what's happening today and, for example, the oil shocks that the world saw in the 70s, largely because those oil shocks happened and people realized how vulnerable the oil markets were. And so they, made adjustments. The biggest adjustment is obviously strategic reserves. So if you're part of I think it's the IEA, I can't remember the exact acronym. It's early for me. Sorry, guys. But if you're one of the countries that imports a lot of oil from OPEC, you're required to have a 90-day reserve of imports. Now, not everybody has that entire 90 days, or they might, but it's like in other countries, like in Australia, they technically have it, but it's actually stored for them in the US. All things considered, when you think of a 90-day strategic import, or a 90-day strategic reserve of all of your oil imports, that's going to last you a lot longer than 90 days when Hormuz is closed, because Hormuz isn't all of the oil in the world. It's only, 20% of trade. I say only, it is a large amount. But even that, there's a portion of that can be sent over bypass pipelines to get around the Strait of Hormuz. Even from that region, it's not a ton, but it's not nothing. That lowers that percentage a little bit. So if you take 90 days and you assume you lose 1/5 of supply, I know some countries rely more on the Strait of Hormuz than others. But basically, you can multiply that by 5, and what's the math off the top of my head? 90 times 5 is what? 450? Is that right?
50. Yeah.
450 days, I think.
Yeah.
I got that
wrong. 450. Yeah.
So that's how much reserves exist. And it doesn't mean they're being deployed right away. They're starting to be deployed. I did see headlines about that today. They'll be deployed actually in more of a trickle. So there will be some allowance for increase of oil prices, but also the strategic reserves will come into play to kind of keep that under control for a certain length of time. And that length of time is long enough to trigger some other market effects. So we have some other differences from the 70s where quite recently, not like that recently, but since the 70s, we've discovered shale oil, in particular in the United States, where you can have access to large supplies of oil in a couple of months. These can be online in like 3 to 6 months. I think maybe faster in times like this where we're under duress, but I'm not sure. But in either case, there's basically effectively unlimited oil supply there, at least for the mid to short term, as long as the Strait of Hormuz could stay closed. And that will also help keep oil prices down. So anything we see today is definitely not going to be a permanent increase by any means. Is it helping Russia? I mean, of course, increased oil prices help Russia, but I don't think it's helping Russia as much as we might think, because Russia is in a different set of market dynamics than the rest of the world. They're heavily sanctioned, and that means they only have a couple of people who are willing to buy from them, mostly China and India. I'll return to India in a second here. But that means that when we see oil prices go up, does Russia as a seller of oil have more leverage? Yes, because your next best option is more expensive. But Russia still doesn't have all that much leverage because these are the only people willing to buy from them. And so you'll see Russian oil prices go up a little bit, but it's not at parity with like what the market is doing. So just as like a rough example, I think in the past we've seen oil prices go up by $20. Russian oil doesn't go up by $20, it goes up by $10. Or if it goes up by $10, Russian oil goes up by $5. And so there's already not a huge amount of profit built into the oil that Russia is selling because the price you're getting is so low. This does make it a little more profitable for them, but by no means, even in a worst case scenario, would it rescue the Russian economy, if that makes sense.
No, it's not going to rescue it. I think it's more of just sheltering it a little bit more. It adds an additional layer of protection. Certainly, it alleviates, even if it's not about the oil itself. I think it's more about alleviating the growing fiscal pressure. Right, the Russian government has been making cuts to public services. Friends of mine who live in Siberia have been telling me, the situation with provision of certain basic energy even has gone up, or the pensions. Pensions is, I think, an underappreciated pressure point for Putin because of how much his voter base is obviously skewed older. And therefore, if you're seeing cuts to pensioners and that broader sort of financial area or institutions, that's a huge consideration for the Kremlin and Putin's longer term. Is he suddenly going to be thrown out of office? No, but the point is he's always got to keep that in the back of his head. It's not always about the inner circle and whether they're putting pressure on Putin. It's more about the fiscal and monetary policy options. And I think that the central bank has largely, well, up until this war, had been exhausting almost every option at its point. So this is exactly what the Kremlin needs. It's diminishing its gold reserves. It's a mess. So certainly, does it resolve Russia's issues? No, but I think it gives them some greatly needed breathing space, because there was a lot of debate around whether the war this year could be decisive or next year, and this seems to have given, I read one piece and I think the Wall Street Journal it's given them an additional 12 months of breathing room, just this 1 week, because of the money it brings in. So I mean, it's a bit speculative. It's difficult to put such concrete figures on those kinds of time horizons, but no, certainly. So one thing I did want to get your take on a little bit more was the remarks by Mojtaba. So this the new supreme leader. Just for context, everyone, he did lose obviously his father, the prior supreme leader, but he also lost his mother and wife. Mm-hmm. So this is not exactly someone who's going to be very cheery and willing to negotiate. And he has said that he used the word lever of blocking the strait should still be used as a way to put that asymmetrical pressure on the United States, disrupt the global economy. Yeah. How much truth do you think there is to that? Is this one of the best options the Islamic Republic has, or do they have other things that could be more useful?
Yeah, it's hard to say how much truth there is to that. I think regardless of the truth, he has to say that, and that has to factor into our calculus here. Like, what else is he going to say? I think it's probably one of the major flaws of the Trump admin strategy in Iran to not consider how important that radical religious element is. I'm a religious person. Yeah, I know that if you were to take out my religious leaders, that's not going to make me stop being religious overnight. It's going to make me even more radical. And of course, in Iran, the most radical people who, are part of the IRGC, that number is close to the hundreds of thousands, but there's obviously millions, if not tens of millions of people who are radical or potentially radical, who this war is going to prove to them everything that their government has been telling them for decades, at least from their perspective. Whether or not it's true, that's going to be their perspective. They've always been told that the United States is just waiting to take them out, that they're a huge threat. And now, like, from their perspective, obviously that's true. And so how do you actually end the war in Iran with, in a good way, with all of this going on? It depends on the objectives. If it's just to take out the leadership and let Iran exist in a state of chaos and kind of destroy themselves, and maybe that is the Trump admin's objective, I'm not saying I agree with it, then maybe that's achievable. But on the other hand, if your goal is actually to make Iran a better place for the people, like we tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously we know that didn't work with large-based ground invasions. It's certainly not going to work with just airstrikes. So to the extent that Iran wants to and has the capability to block the Strait of Hormuz, I think that they're going to have the motivation to continue doing that as long as they have the capability to do it. So the question for me isn't what are they saying? That's not a surprise to me. It's what capabilities do they actually have in reality, and what counters actually exist to those capabilities. And I'm not personally convinced that they have the capabilities to keep the strait closed over the long term, maybe from the short to medium term. But again, I look at the reserves that the global oil economy has. I look at the other oil production that could come online. And when I think about all those things in combination and how those could help abate the crisis in Hormuz, I don't think that Iran has the capability to keep the strait closed long enough to create a serious enough problem for the global economy. I'm not saying there's going to be no problems. There's obviously going to be real problems. Prices are going to go up, and that's going to have repercussions. But the global economy has existed at prices near where they are today for a long time. We've been experiencing a remarkable period of low energy prices, and that's been wonderful. But the global economy's had high energy prices before, and they've adapted in a number of ways.
Well, no, look at Ukraine. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion, prices jumped, I think, 4 times what they've been. We're actually, relative to the size that they were in the first couple of weeks, months of the full-scale invasion 4 years ago, a fraction. They are high, but they've also gone down. And I think this attributes to 2 factors here. Firstly, markets have learned to price in, so to speak, geopolitical disruption. Geopolitical uncertainty has returned as one of the primary, drivers or considerations of businesses, of the private sector. If you read anything from S&P Global or McKinsey or something like that, those big consultancies, for what they're worth, geopolitical tensions has returned as a primary one, versus 10 years ago or 15. It was not so much that. It was more about terrorism or climate change or economic shocks of that more traditional nature. But the second factor is also the Middle East. And I say this not because I feel that way, but unfortunately, just not a lot of people seem to care very much. This whole idea that World War III is going to break out never really applies to the Middle East, because you don't have enough major powers involved. Of course, the Russians could theoretically, the Chinese could theoretically, but that makes no rational sense. And therefore, that leaves 2 main predominant powers, right? The United States with its nuclear arsenal, and Israel with its relative nuclear weapon size. So the point being is that for World War III to actually exist, it has to expand beyond the perimeters of the Middle East, which it never really does. And this scenario of the United States versus Iran is one that we've all been fearing for a long time. The Islamic Republic has been preparing for much of its existence. So I personally think that the markets are volatile, yes, but unless we do see a complete shutting, which, to your point, seems unlikely in a sustained period, I don't think we're going to see as much disruption as February 24th, 2022. But I'm also kind of curious, like, what do you think this means for the United States? You're in you're in well, actually, which state are you in? You're in Central America, right?
I'm in Utah.
You're in Utah. Okay, well, I want to go
Central America is below Mexico, man.
Oh, Central is in central part of America.
I gotta give you Europeans a hard time because you guys always give us a hard time for not knowing Utah.
Middle Valley, Tornado Valley. No, that's too.
I'm in Utah, Mountain States.
No, I want to go to Salt Lake City very much. But no, my point being more so much apart from my misguided geography is simply that, yes, the Americans can put enough pressure on the Iranians to not close the strait. But this is still a time-sensitive issue, right? Trump has limited political capital, if anything at all. And so what my main emphasis in most of my videos is that the Iranians are simply just trying to outlast the Americans. They don't have to win outright. They can't. What they have to do, though, is ensure that the Americans, the Trump administration, receives so much negative backlash that they try and find an off-ramp. Do you agree with such a sentiment, or do you think that's missing the point a little bit?
No, I think that's probably the best strategy Iran has, and it's very plausible. And that could be why they're doing what they're doing in the Strait of Hormuz, and because they know it influences headlines, they know it brings backlash on Trump and gets him to respond. One thing I've said about America versus Iran for a long time, America is no doubt the stronger country. Like, of course, if it came to an all-out war where all resources on both sides were invested, America would win. But the problem is that Americans don't really have an appetite for that sort of thing. In America, I think it's probably a good thing, but in America, when we lose a soldier, like one soldier, it's really a catastrophe. If you think about the sorrow in our nation over Iraq and Afghanistan, which as far as wars go, actually had a relatively low number of casualties overall, a low number of deaths. There is still huge backlash in the States against that because we don't have the appetite for seeing our soldiers die. Again, that's probably a good thing. And that's especially accentuated because these wars aren't happening on our soil, right? If it was on our soil, maybe it'd be a different story. It'd be an existential war, a war for our very existence. And so when you put those two things against each other, that's why America seems to lose wars like in Afghanistan or Vietnam, even if people will say we didn't lose them. Well, we didn't win them, and maybe that's what matters more. And that same thing could certainly happen in Iran. It's a country of 90 million people. They've been told America is the great enemy for a very, very long period of time. Their willpower to outlast us in this war is probably much greater than ours, like if we're honest. I mean, even Trump's approval among his own party has dipped. I'm not saying it's like gone completely away, but it's dipped as a result of this war. So even his best supporters often aren't really that supportive of what's happening here. So could Iran outweigh the United States? I think absolutely. Now, but you have to caveat that I don't think the United States is leaving the war in Iran with Iran having like capabilities to attack other countries still online. So we're going to do everything we can to take out their nuclear capabilities, their ballistic missile capabilities, their drone capabilities to the best of our ability, because we have no other option at this point. We've poked the bear, to use that phrase. But that aside, like, I think if we accomplish all of that and there's a regime in power that we don't like, I don't think that we have the political willpower probably to do what's necessary to actually see that mission through to its complete fulfillment. And I think we've already seen some kind of backtracking on objectives from the Trump administration as the war has progressed already in response to American sentiment. So that's a huge factor.
No, I think it is. You, like me, I think we're pretty balanced, right? We try to be reasonable in our assessment, acknowledging both sides of a debate, but that often makes you unpopular with people who take more of a hardline perspective on either side. And I've not been very popular amongst certain people who think that because I'm saying the Iranians can outlast the Americans, that they somehow can go militarily toe to toe. No, that's not what I'm saying. Geopolitics is not black and white. It's very gray and it's nuanced and it's messy. And the point is, though, that the Iranians don't have to do everything tit for tat. They just have to be more clandestine. And I think this brings me to, you mentioned it in just a minute ago about the idea of a ground offensive. This idea that somehow we could arm the Kurds, and that would lead to a common uprising within Iran. Now, there's two considerations with this, which one of them is partially a new segment, and the other one is just the sheer size of the forces involved, which is Firstly, I think it was in Al Jazeera 3 or 4 days ago. The Syrian Kurds, because there's different types of Kurds that are transnational across the borders of the various countries, 4 or 5 countries. But they basically warned the Iranian Kurds from considering the idea of undertaking some kind of offensive, right, an assault, whatever it is, supported by American air power. Okay, that's not a good start. But second, you mentioned it as well. The IRGC has, from my understanding, 100 to 150,000 troops or personnel. Now, these aren't your average conventional military. These are ideologically hard, driven, motivated fighters. Then you have the besieged military, which is conservative, let's be conservative, 80,000. And then the Artesh, which is the conventional military, and I always think is not referenced enough, 200 to 300,000. Now, if we are very, generalistic and give it, let's just say they have 500,000 personnel. Okay, some of them might defect, some of them might desert, some of them, etc., etc. Those are, possibilities. But even then, even if 10%, that's still possibly the entirety of what the Kurdish force, from context I have on the ground, have said, you might have 40, 50,000 Kurds who could do this. Okay, that's not a great balance of four sides, right? So I just find this a frankly bit of a pipe dream that we can believe this to be a reasonable outcome. That yes, the Americans could use aerial assets and they could destroy a bunch of things. Of course, that would balance it a little bit more, but that would require a huge, elongated, protracted campaign, and there's no guarantee that anything even comes of it. So what, the Kurds are undertaking guerrilla warfare in the western part of Iran? And to your very last point, so this particular aspect really grinds my gears a little bit because I just find it so unconvincing. That would mean that a common uprising amongst the people. I haven't seen that. I have not seen Iranians getting on the streets and showing any form of resistance, not because they can't, but because I think that there is more of a nuanced picture within the country.
Yeah. A lot of points there that I agree with. I mean, the Kurds in particular, even if they do invade Iran, their objective isn't to overthrow the entire country. What do the Kurds care about? They care about Kurdistan.
Yeah.
Which I won't get into all the details there, but that encompasses a portion of, northwestern Iran. It's not like all of Iran. And so we would need more than the Kurds if we wanted to move forward with a ground invasion. Now, that might help destabilize things. It would certainly work in our favor, but it's not a solution. It's at best, it's a part of a solution. And to your point, it's really fascinating that we're not seeing protesters rise up. And I think that was kind of the expectation. And I think this was a big miscalculation. Unfortunately, what the United States did when they attacked Iran is they actually legitimized the government more, if you think about it. Because the government's claim to power has always been, look, we're going to do things that you don't like, but we're going to do that because that's what's necessary to protect you, for example, from the United States and from Israel. And when you're not actually being attacked by the United States and Israel, that kind of rings hollow. And you look at how you're suffering at the hands of your own government. And that's, I think, part of the reason Iran is always trying to poke small fights, because a small provocation with the United States and Israel, that actually helps keep their people loyal to them. You always want somebody to have a greater enemy than you, even if they don't like you, because that's what keeps people loyal. Now we have the United States and Israel attacking Iran all over the place, and they've made some really bad mistakes in the process. They've hit this girls' school, for example, which I'm positive is all over the place on Iranian media. And this could be a large reason why people aren't rising up to overthrow their government, even though they just did that like a couple of months ago. Because if anything, the propaganda effort the government had in response to that, along with the U.S. now doing actions that, at least in some people's minds, will legitimize the government, or even if they're not fully over the line, there's at least going to be a question mark in their heads that creates a problem. And again, I say all these things, I'm not saying I agree with them. I'm just trying to explain the social dynamics that occur in a country like Iran. And so I don't know that we can count on an uprising to do our dirty work for us. And as far as, the number of soldiers that Iran has across their various militaries, nothing aids in recruitment more than your country being attacked and invaded. And so the numbers as they exist today Even though some people might desert, they would also likely be able to recruit a whole lot more on top of those. And these are all very good reasons why very smart generals for a long time have advised the United States to not invade Iran, not conduct a ground invasion, because number one, it's impractical. It's a mountainous country, just like Afghanistan, very difficult to fight. And number two, it causes all these dynamics I've just explained, which can actually make the situation worse, not better.
No, and there's a great book by Tim Marshall called Prisoners of Geography, 10 Maps That Tell You Everything You Need to Know About Global Politics. I'm sure you've read it. And for those of you who don't haven't yet, it's a great book. I highly recommend it. I've
it somewhere.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you should. I've got a bookshelf here, actually. Maybe it's on there. But yeah, you've got all your books on display. But no, I highly recommend people. I've chatted with Tim in the past. And, Iran is one of those countries that is incredibly blessed, much like the United States in many ways. If you think about it as an example, you've got no immediate threats on your eastern and west border, and then you've got two much weaker and largely friendly countries to your north and south. So the United States has been given a great hand. In contrast, Russia has a really quite bad hand, actually, because it's always been threatened from its west. It's got low-lying land, the Great Plains. You've got smaller countries that are relatively weaker, but that is not great, because then that means other great powers like China and India and everything like that. So, and also because once you're so big, it's difficult to manage your own borders. So geography hugely important there. And Iran is an example because you've got the natural mountains in the northwest as a barrier, the south with the immediate access to the oceans, and then straight into India. So that was great, or Indian Ocean. So that's great for mercantilism and trade routes. And obviously right in the middle, technically, of one of the biggest continents. So you've got major parties that you can trade with. So I think that's a huge factor here, and let alone the motivation of the people to get up and fight, so to speak. And I do just want to re-underline it again, which is that the IRGC are not a conventional military. These are they're not just in the military sphere. They are intertwined with the economics. So many of the senior IRGC officers are incredibly influential in what happens in the economy, and that's why more people. I made a video on this a couple of days ago. Argue that if Mujtaba doesn't have a clear handle on the situation, there was one piece I read earlier that says he's in a coma, and this piece that was written by him is actually just the media, doing damage control. But the Iran becomes a more militant state. It becomes a security state, a police state, which would be far much more terrifying for the United States, because you've got the IRGC running around, managing their own internal economy and country, radicalizing even more people. That's a scenario that I don't, there would, again, speculative, but there were some people saying that Khamenei actually kept them in check because Khamenei was more theological, whilst the IRGC, still ideologically minded, were still creating this entire system that is very pragmatically minded with the finances and all that sort of stuff. So, I mean, I'm not an intricate Iran expert, but these sorts of things make me very concerned about where we're going with the IRGC being as intact as it is. And I think a ground operation would be heavily misguided. But I don't know if you've got any more to add on that, but I would love to hear a bit more bringing in Ukraine, because I see we've got some comments on that.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. I'll just say better. There's a reason there's a phrase, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. We just don't know what's going to happen. And we may find ourselves in a situation where we're glad Khomeini's gone, but we don't know what comes next, and it could be worse. It could be better. We don't know. We don't know.
No, that's true.
I hope it's a lot better. But we don't know. There's a lot of reasons to believe it could be better. Unfortunately, it seems like there's more reasons to believe it could be worse. Still hope for the best for now, but we'll be honest about whatever happens, right? Or at least I will.
Hey, what are you trying to say?
I was not against you. I would meant the media in general, and then I realized.
Oh yeah, no, this is a bit of there's a little bit of simplification here, and there's a lot of disinformation on YouTube increasingly. Well, actually, just on a tangent, everyone, Paul had yet another channel which I discovered. That was it was just AI slop this time. It wasn't even just someone ripping off your videos. They'd made an AI version of you to read out your own scripts, which was. I told people to report it. I hope it has been banned, but that was quite terrifying to see this sort of AI pool on my feed.
Already changed its name and it started using a different AI avatar. So
so it's still up. Oh wow, that's
still up, but it's changed. Its description still says it's the Paul Warburg whatever channel, but the name has changed. It's hilarious.
I'm disappointed. I've only had one person stealing from me, and it's they were banned immediately. So didn't even have time to build up a legacy. Still, we've touched upon Ukraine a lot, and a lot of people have mentioned it. So I'd like to hear from you what you feel about the role of Ukraine in all of this. Do you think that the Ukrainians can be supportive to the Saudis, to the Americans, or
yeah, they are.
How far do you think that could go?
I think it could go quite far. You know, what's brilliant about the support Ukraine can provide, you know, people are worried that that would detract from their broader war effort. I doubt it. Ukraine, the reason their advantages are so good is because the technology they use is so cheap and so easy to produce, and they've specifically developed it for that purpose. Their drones can actually be 3D printed, which means I don't know all the ins and outs of this, but it's much easier to set up like 3D printing in the Gulf states to get large quantities of interceptor drones there quickly than it is, for example, to manufacture Patriots and get them over there. So Ukraine's going to be a huge help. And I've argued in so many different ways that the Iran war, well, you know, we talked about oil prices, that helps Russia. I still think in the net, the war is a huge benefit to Ukraine, much more than Russia. I'll just make a couple points and I'll get back to like how Ukraine benefits. But, you know, even if Russia's oil economy benefits to the maximum degree possible, much more than I'm even expecting, I still think Russia loses because their economy is a means to an end, not an end in and of itself, as far as the war is concerned. And what their economy does is it allows them to recruit soldiers and, you know, acquire technology and things like that. Iran, you know, them being taken offline, taken out of the picture, reduces a major supply that Russia's been depending on, which is the Shahed drones. Now, Russia produces these on Russian territory now, but almost certainly there are key components, probably the most key components that are not easy to replicate or manufacture without expertise that Iran is still providing, because that's the only way Iran could enforce a licensing agreement to allow Russia to manufacture these on their own soil while still getting payment from Russia, because who's going to enforce, you know, Russia not paying Iran what they're due? So they had to have some kind of leverage over Russia to do that. So Russia's going to lose at least a lot of its Shahed capability. It might not go away completely, but it's going to be on the downtrend for a while, and the oil prices are only going to be temporary. But even on top of that, so now let's get back to Ukraine. Ukraine is benefiting massively geopolitically from this. And it's something I've been talking about, and I've been told I'm crazy about for years, but you know, each time I talk about it, I'm told I'm a little less crazy because you can see it actually happening, where Ukraine is going to become a global arms dealer, for lack of a better word. Has negative connotations, but it gives you strong geopolitical power. Ukraine is the expert in drone warfare, and I've said that one day there would be wars that would happen and people would realize they need what Ukraine has, and that would position Ukraine very well to build partnerships, the like of which, for example, the Soviet Union and the United States built to create kind of spheres of influence around the world. That's actually happening now. You know, these Gulf states, think about it, they're being protected theoretically by the United States and Israel, two of the most powerful militaries on the planet, the United States in particular. They're still going to Ukraine for additional help because they don't believe that what the United States is providing is sufficient to protect them. And to make themselves feel safe as a country, they're going to Ukraine for their drone expertise. That's huge. It's not just huge for Ukraine in the future. It does show a path to recovery for Ukraine through, you know, the arms trade directly, but mostly through the soft power that comes through the arms trade, because you always want to have good relationships with the people who create the weapons that you depend on. But it's going to help Ukraine a lot in their war against Russia today, because it's going to have a lot of countries saying, hey, we'd really like it if Ukraine actually survived and maybe even won this war, So we're going to be more willing to support Ukraine because we see supporting Ukraine as a way to support us. We've already seen that in Europe, for example, where they're allowing to be built Ukrainian drone production facilities on European soil. They're not just, licensing Ukrainian technology. They are integrating their own militaries with Ukraine's military through Ukrainian production capacity on their soil. And it's in that context where Ukraine is doing that for them that they're now providing this 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine, which is very meaningful. It's going to allow them financially to have the consistency to keep fighting for a couple of years. So these are just one example of where that's already played out. And I would expect that that dynamic might increase with the Gulf states, which is hugely important. The Gulf states have largely been seen as more neutral, maybe sometimes even a little more pro-Russian.
Russian sympathetic, I'd say. And the Emirates.
I think that they actually have an incentive to not be Russian sympathetic, though, when you think about how they make their money. Because Russia economically is a major competitor with them, right? And now that Russia's run. Go ahead.
No. I just wanted to make one quick point. The only reason I interject on that is because it makes me think of when the Emirates parade Putin around in a open air limo. Now you can argue it's a lot of diplomatic fanfare, but certainly it's changing. Perhaps the Gulf states are changing, but I don't know. I wonder whether they've really been that sympathetic to Ukraine. But
they haven't. Because they haven't needed Ukraine, and they've been benefiting a lot from Russia. Because you think of the Emirates, what's there, Dubai, where's all that Russian money from the billionaires fleeing Russia going? It's going there, and so they have had a financial incentive. Let's be kind of more pro-Russian, but they haven't been like explicitly pro-Russian. They haven't been
fair enough.
Weapons or anything like that. They have been benefiting from Russia, but now they're in a situation where they are actually in threat, and they're not going to Russia for help against the Iranian Shahheads. They're going to Ukraine for help. And then when you think of the underlying dynamic, they make their money from energy sales. So does Russia. It actually benefits them more to partner with somebody like Ukraine than it does Russia economically from the oil trade perspective. Although, again, there was a moment in time where they benefited a lot because Russian oligarchs were bringing their money to Dubai. There's no rules, that kind of thing. So I think they speak a language. I think they're very practical countries geopolitically. They're kind of neutral. They don't really take sides, but the language they do speak is money. And like everybody else, the language that they speak is their own personal protection. And I think that people are realizing, and this is just one example, by the way, this is just the start of a trend, but people are realizing they need Ukraine maybe than they once thought they might.
No, I think it's a good, I think that's a great argument. I would just add to it simply by saying, when you talk about these production facilities in Europe, what is that indicating, right? That's a great foundation by which to accelerate interoperability vis-a-vis NATO, obviously, or maybe EU if that's, if we want to be more open about where this goes. But certainly the fact that it goes back to the summer. I'll take a step back. So when the Russians were probing, provoking, the different airspaces across Eastern Europe, or in Central Europe, to be fair, it was a huge concern about how to manage these sabotage type attacks or drone. And clearly Ukrainian interceptor methods have been instrumental of part of that. I've got plenty of colleagues around, Brussels and Europe who've told me how much they've been deepening. Germany just comes to mind, or Denmark, for deepening their integration in this specific area with the drone warfare, because who's at the forefront of it? It's Ukraine and, well, by extension, Moscow. So these two countries know the most. And I can give you another example just to flip it on its head, but Africa. I lived in Africa for a few years, and from my experience there, this was in the early phases of drone warfare beginning to emerge. One country that really took it up was Ethiopia. And we've seen them now being leveraged in Rwanda or in the war in Sudan with the RSF or Rapid Support Forces on the one side, this paramilitary group, or the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, which is more the conventional government forces. My point being is that both sides have leveraged contacts from Ukraine and Russia in their own way to seek advice about using drone warfare. And ironically, the Emiratis, which have taken advice from other countries about drone warfare, have then distilled that information to the different African nations as well. So it's a trickle down effect. So no, certainly I think it's going to be fascinating to see how Ukraine can leverage this over the Gulf states. And I was just wondering, do you have any more information about that Saudi Ukrainian link that you were mentioning? Because I think Saudi Arabia is the big consideration here, the big stakeholder.
Yeah, like I said, I just glanced at the article before I jumped on, so I haven't like looked into it too deeply. But what I saw was there was speculation that there would be a deal today for Ukraine to sell Saudi Arabia drone interceptors, and that it would be signed and minted today. And actually, along with that, there was, I don't know if it's going to happen, but it was saying that the United States, all they needed was Trump's signature, basically, to purchase a bunch of Ukrainian interceptor drones. Now, they had that same deal offered to them last summer. We had that same deal offered to us, the United States, last summer, and it didn't exactly pan out, to our shame. But yeah, so whether it happens today or not, I think Saudi Arabia will end up doing something with Ukraine with these interceptors.
So we've been talking for the best part of what, 45 minutes, 50 minutes now. I guess, you know, I've seen a couple of comments from people saying they'd like us to do this more often. I think this is great, actually. Maybe we should do this occasionally, given how crazy the situation is with Iran. But anyone's got a question, then do drop them in the chat and I will bring them up. But I guess, Paul, you know, whilst we're sort of waiting for anyone to add their thoughts or questions, where do you see this going? Are we going to see a drawdown? Is it just we're in this is this the new normal for the next few weeks? Airstrikes occasionally, different pockets of tension, like Lebanon looks very vulnerable. Iran itself?
It's too soon to say, so I'll hedge my bets. Yeah, I think that's fine to, you know, I don't know the future. I think long-term, the Strait of Hormuz will be opened. I'll tell you where I don't see it going. I don't see, for example, it becoming World War III with China super involved in like fighting on the side of Iran. I hope I'm not proven wrong, but I don't think I will be.
Mo Bizzle says it is sadly World War III, but oh, right, for Russia it would be World War IV, according to Lil G. I'm not sure what World War IV would look like, to be honest with you. I don't think I was that just pure AIs. Okay, here's an interesting. Is Russia giving Iran targeting information? Do you think how much do you think Iran has been receiving intelligence from Moscow?
There would be zero surprise from me if Russia was giving Iran information.
But
zero. I'd be surprised if they weren't.
But what does that do for Trump's relationship with Putin? Because Putin is trying to demonstrate himself as the mediator, that he's Trump's chum, and yet he's providing intelligence to the group of enemies that Trump is trying to eradicate. How does that work?
Unfortunately, Trump has already commented on this, and his comment was basically, well, we do it to them, so why wouldn't they do it to us? Which is like not a very strong statement from the president of the United States about.
He really doesn't want to say anything negative or wrong about Mr. Putin, does he?
He didn't there.
That's insane. I hadn't heard that. Wow, that's incredible. Okay, got a question. What would be the best response to a totalitarian regime resulting tens of thousands process when sanctions are already maximally applied? Well, that's a loaded question. I
have no sympathy for the Ayatollah. I'm glad he's gone. So if you think that that's what we were saying in this chat, I don't think either me or Piotr were saying that. I'll let Piotr speak for himself, but that's not really the question here. The question is, do we do it in a way that's gonna actually accomplish the best results in the long term, or are we just gonna cause more harm than good? That remains to be seen.
Yeah, look, I think it's pretty clear that no one of a reasonable mind or decency would support the Islamic Republic, Khamenei, or any of that. But it's not that simple just to say that you go in there and you eradicate that. Nation building, regime change, state building has never worked. And if it does, it's cost the country that implements it as much in some ways as the receiving country, be that from a financial perspective, psychological impact on the soldiers, the population suffering, let alone the tens of thousands of people who were killed in the actual country where it happened. Moreover, we don't live in a world where regime change is effective. Limited warfare in the format of drones and everything that we were just talking about is primarily how warfare is done these days. And there's no appetite for that anymore. And to be honest with you, I'll go out on a whim on saying this, but I'll be very clear in how I view it. In some ways, I see Trump's operation in Iran becoming almost like a Soviet Afghanistan, not because it's the same exact kind of military operation, but in the sense that they went in there. They didn't try to nation build. The Soviets didn't try to nation build, but they spent half their time of the 80s actually trying to get out. And I can see this becoming a huge dumpster fire for the Trump administration, in that they undertake, let's say, this ground offensive, and they realize it's gone skewy. And so they spend half their time actually just trying to find a way out. They didn't do that with their version of Afghanistan, because they decided to stay in, sit, do nation building, and try to create a democratic Afghanistan in the Middle East or whatever, in Central Asia, Southern Asia. So that's different to me than what Trump is trying to do there. He doesn't really care too much about the country. He wants the economy, he wants the oil, he wants the lack of threat to American interests. So from that regard, I see this more as a sort of mess, an Afghan Soviet style. I don't know if my example makes sense to you, Paul, but
it makes sense.
Yeah, I need to do a better job of framing it, I think, but I think it makes sense.
I understand what you're saying. I would also, in response to that, I would point out that this is not the only dictator in the world who is currently, or was currently, doing terrible things to his own people. I mean, this happens all the time in Africa. So many things happen that we never hear about. And so while it is potentially a reason, or maybe an excuse to go in and do something, if our real motivation was like to be helping the peoples of these countries that are being, brutalized by their own leaders, which is a terrible thing, our scope of mission would be a lot larger than Iran. It would include like very, very many countries in Africa, other places in Latin America at certain times. And I would also point out, we've been talking about this, for example, with Russia and Ukraine, where, what Russia is doing to Ukraine is this horrible war. Millions of people are affected, displaced, and we've been asking for greater intervention from the United States there in that particular situation, and it hasn't come. And so wherever you land on any of these issues, I always just urge people towards consistency. Like, if you don't want intervention, then don't call for it. If you do want intervention, then maybe call for it, but also call for it to be done in a wise way with a defined mission that can actually be accomplished.
Yeah, I agree. This is where I get slightly nerdy, because I find theory is quite interesting. But during my education, right, you learn about realism or liberalism or constructivism in international relations. And whilst we can say whether they're applicable, I think if people cast their minds back to January, when Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, gave that notable speech, it wasn't flawless. There were some people who disagreed with it severely. But to me, I think it was quite important, because it goes to what you just said, Paul, which is simply that either be consistent in your implementation or adherence to what you stand by, right? That's why Spain is outraging so many people, because whether you like him or not, the leader is remaining consistent, or he's not going to give America access to this, that, and the other. So either be consistent, or don't try to, preach these principles if you're then going to reject them or be oppose them, or just not uphold them. Britain is a good example right now. So Starmer said he is not happy with what America did in Venezuela, right, when it happened. And then 2 weeks later, with that oil tanker, the British helped them seize it, which was coming from Venezuela. So it doesn't sound great to a lot of people. You mentioned Africa. A lot of African nations are very pragmatic about this, right? They just have to deal with the hand that they've been dealt from the remnants of colonialism. So ironically, some of the biggest upholders of international law, or the UN, are African nations, because they realize it's the best opportunity they have to actually have their voices heard. And then Trump comes along and throws it all out the window with big power and might is right and stuff. So in my opinion, be consistent with what you believe in, and keep your policies as well. Otherwise, you have no right to go around stating it should be done like this, because you're doing the very thing that you, I hate the hypocrisy, and I think that's what a lot of nations resent about Western nations. But, this has all been thrown out of the window with Iran, and I do worry about how far this is going to go. I thought when this started it would be a couple of weeks, but every day it seems to be Trump's like, nope, we're going to go conditional surrender, and then he's hinting at maybe some kind of drawdown. I really don't know. So anyway, we could go round and round in circles, but I think it's been a good chat with you, Paul. Everyone watching, thank you very much. Is there anything you're working on, Paul? Anything you want to shout out before we log off?
I have a lot of videos covering the stuff we've talked about here in more depth, with maybe a little more precision, a little less off the cuff. So if you want to learn more, check out my recent videos. Yeah,
you've been away for a little bit more time. As you said, you're 6 hours behind me, 5 hours. It's like what, 11, 12 for you?
11.
Yeah. Oh, it's 11. Okay.
It's not that early anymore, but I have a baby, a very young baby. So
yeah, well, well, thanks a lot for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this, then yeah, subscribe to both of us. Do check out Paul's stuff, and we'll see you on the flip side. Take care.